I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. Shroud of Turin research project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to...
What if the most analyzed religious artifact in history just revealed something science can't explain, and no one wants to talk about it? For decades, experts believed the Shroud of Turin was nothing more than a medieval creation, a clever illusion wrapped in faith. But now, new DNA findings have shaken that narrative to its core. A top European genetics team expected to uncover centuries of contamination, traces of monks, pilgrims, and restorers. Instead, they discovered something impossible to ignore: mitochondrial DNA markers from 3 different continents, all embedded within the same ancient fibers. Sequences that should never exist together. Patterns of degradation that don't follow the rules of time. And at the center of it all stands Barrie Schwortz, the man who spent over 40 years studying the Shroud, originally as a skeptic, determined to expose it as a fake. But what he uncovered changed everything. Before we reveal what this discovery truly means, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next is something many institutions would rather you never hear. 3 researchers quietly removed their names from the study, not because the science was wrong, but because the implications were too unsettling. This wasn't just contamination. This was a mystery that defied explanation. And now, the question remains: if the evidence doesn't fit history, then what exactly are we looking at? The man who never wanted to believe. To understand why the DNA results hit Barrie Schwortz with the force they did, you first need to understand who Barrie Schwortz is and why he was the last person anyone would have expected to become the world's leading scientific voice on the Shroud of Turin. Schwortz was a technical photographer of the highest order, the kind of precision imaging specialist that NASA trusted with classified work. When a team of elite American scientists approached him in the late 1970s to serve as the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, the first and only scientific team ever granted direct, in-depth access to the cloth, Schwortz nearly laughed them out of the room. He was Jewish. He had zero theological attachment to a Christian relic. He had spent his career in the world of hard science and harder evidence. His working assumption was that the Shroud was a medieval painting, that he would fly to Turin, spend a few days spotting brushstrokes, enjoy a European vacation on someone else's budget, and be home within the week. He reportedly joked about it at conferences. That joke haunted him for the next 4 decades. The moment Schwortz stood face to face with the cloth in Turin, something shifted. When the Shroud's image is viewed in photographic negative, it transforms into something that stops trained professionals cold. Lash marks across the body rendered in forensic detail, facial features with startling anatomical precision, and wounds located in the wrists, not the palms, as every medieval artist had painted them for centuries. The wrists, a detail that no medieval forger could have known, because the anatomical knowledge confirming that wrist wounds, not palm wounds, were required to support the weight of a crucified body simply did not exist yet. Schwortz later described what he saw in precise, professional language. There was something unique about the image on the Shroud, something that was not typical of any other image he had ever encountered in his career. And his career had taken him everywhere. The Shroud of Turin research project team worked 5 straight days and nights on the cloth, barely sleeping, running experiment after experiment with every scientific instrument they had brought to Turin. Schwortz photographed every microscopic fiber, every marking, every anomaly, using infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet fluorescence photography, X-ray radiography, and microchemical analysis. They brought decades of combined expertise in physics, chemistry, biology, imaging science, and forensic medicine. And what they found, or more precisely, what they failed to find, stopped them. No brushstrokes, no pigments, no dye, no scorch marks, no photographic chemicals, nothing from any known artistic technique from any era in human history could explain how the image had been formed on the linen surface. It had not been painted, it had not been burned, it had not been photographed. Every method they tested failed to account for what they were looking at. But the most extraordinary finding was not what was absent. It was what was present and where. The image on the shroud penetrates only the outermost fibrils of the linen threads, a layer thinner than a human hair. No paint soaks through like that. No dye sits that shallow while leaving the interior of each thread completely untouched. The precision of the image's depth is itself an impossibility, a characteristic that no known artistic or photographic method from any period in history can replicate, because no such method controls coloration at that microscopic a level. In 2005, Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro at Italy's ENEA Research Center attempted to reproduce just a fraction of this characteristic using the most advanced ultraviolet excimer laser available to modern science. After years of laboratory trials, his team managed to create superficial coloring on individual linen fibers, but only on a patch roughly the size of a postage stamp. Scaling that result to the full dimensions of the shroud, by Di Lazzaro's own published calculations, would require a simultaneous burst of ultraviolet light, producing 34 trillion watts of power. No technology in human history from any century comes remotely close to generating that. The STRP team published their findings in peer-reviewed scientific journals. The broader scientific establishment's response was not rebuttal. It was silence. The kind of deliberate, coordinated institutional silence that, in science, communicates more than any counter-argument. The Jewish skeptic and the NASA engineer. During the project's planning phase, Schwortz found himself sitting in a meeting with Don Lin, a man whose credentials were about as far from fringe research as it is possible to get. Lin had worked on NASA's Voyager mission, the spacecraft that sent back humanity's first close-up images of Jupiter and Saturn. He had worked on the Galileo mission. He was one of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's top imaging specialists, and his security clearance alone represented a level of institutional trust that most researchers never approach. When Lin spoke, the room listened. And what Lin said to Schwortz changed the trajectory of the next 40 years of his life. Schwortz confronted him directly. "Why am I here? I am Jewish. I have no connection to this. What possible reason could there be for my involvement in a scientific investigation of a Christian relic?" Lin's response was quiet and matter-of-fact. Jesus was Jewish too. And then, his voice dropping, "Maybe God specifically wanted one of his chosen people on this particular team." Schwortz later described the hairs rising on the back of his neck. The room felt different. Lin told him simply to go to Turin, do his best professional work, and trust that the larger purpose would reveal itself in time. Schwortz went to Turin, and the purpose revealed itself, though not in the way or the time frame that anyone could have predicted. Even after everything Schwortz witnessed and documented firsthand in Turin, he did not believe. For 18 years, he held onto a single piece of counter-evidence that anchored his skepticism against everything else he had seen. The blood on the shroud was still red. Any forensic professional with basic knowledge of hematology knows that blood darkens to brown within hours of leaving the body. Ancient bloodstains should be dark, almost black. The fact that the stains on the shroud retained their reddish color was, to Schwortz, the one detail that prevented him from accepting what his own research was telling him. For nearly 2 decades, that single observation held the line against an overwhelming body of evidence, pointing in the opposite direction. Then, in 1995, the phone rang. On the other end was Dr. Alan Adler, a Harvard-educated biochemist, a world-renowned blood chemistry expert, a fellow Jewish researcher with an impeccable record in peer-reviewed hematology. Adler was not a peripheral figure. When he spoke authoritatively about blood evidence, forensic institutions and government agencies listened. What Adler told Schwortz in that call was this: the blood samples from the shroud contained abnormally elevated bilirubin levels, extremely elevated. And what those levels meant, in specific, clinical, biochemical terms, was that the person whose blood was on that cloth had undergone extreme, prolonged physical trauma before death. Severe beating, sustained torture, the kind of physical devastation that overwhelms the liver's capacity to process bilirubin, flooding the bloodstream with concentrations so high that the resulting blood chemistry permanently prevents darkening. Blood with elevated bilirubin levels of that magnitude stays red. It never darkens, ever. Schwartz's hands went cold. The evidence had been in front of him for 20 years. He had simply not had the specialized biochemical knowledge to read it correctly. In the space of that single phone call, every carefully maintained line of doubt dissolved. The blood chemistry was not just consistent with authenticity, it was consistent with exactly the kind of violent death the Shroud had always claimed to document. And then, years later, came the DNA, and it made the blood chemistry look straightforward by comparison. The DNA nobody was supposed to find. When Dr. Gianni Barcaccia's team at the University of Padua's Department of Agronomy extracted DNA from the shroud's surface fibers, the expectation was unremarkable. Standard procedure for any historical artifact analysis: identify contamination sources, map the genetic noise of centuries of human handling, and produce a baseline for future research. What the team published was technically accurate. Researchers found traces of DNA consistent with historical handling. That statement is true. It is also, according to those who reviewed the full findings, a carefully sanitized half-truth. What Barcaccia's team actually found were distinct mitochondrial haplogroups from populations that had no logical reason to appear together on a single piece of first-century linen. Haplogroup L2 concentrated in sub-Saharan West Africa. Haplogroup M deeply rooted in the Indian subcontinent. Sequences matching Jewish communities from the Eastern Mediterranean. Ancient genetic markers tied to populations spanning 3 separate continents, all concentrated on one burial cloth that had supposedly been stored in Europe for the last 7 centuries. The team initially assumed laboratory cross-contamination. They ran the analysis again. The results were identical. They ran it a 3rd time, using fresh samples from different areas of the fabric. The pattern held. If the cloth had simply accumulated contamination from centuries of European handlers, monks, restorers, pilgrims, the dominant genetic signature would be predictably European. French, Italian, perhaps some broader Mediterranean variation. That is not what appeared. The European signal was present, but it was not the dominant story. The dominant story was a geographic distribution so unusual that it collapsed every standard contamination model forensic geneticists use to explain how DNA accumulates on historical artifacts. Barcaccia's team systematically attempted to account for the data through known historical channels, trade routes, Crusader contact, Ottoman-era transport. None of the models held under scrutiny. The haplogroup distribution was too specific, too concentrated in particular areas of the cloth, and too diverse to be explained by any single historical pathway. And then there was the detail that reportedly kept Dr. Ferrara, Barcaccia's colleague on the project, awake at night. Several mitochondrial sequences displayed degradation patterns that did not conform to normal biological decay over centuries. Standard ancient DNA fragments in characteristic ways that geneticists understand well and can model accurately. But some of the Shroud sequences were fragmented differently, in ways that Ferrara described in an internal review meeting as corrupted in ways I cannot attribute to time alone. That phrase, cannot attribute to time alone, sent a chill through the department. If time did not cause the degradation, something else did. An energy event, an unknown chemical interaction, something for which the existing scientific framework has no category. 3 members of the analysis team quietly removed their names from the published paper. Not because the methodology was flawed, not because the results were unreliable, but because they could not explain what they had found and could not afford to be publicly associated with data that had no explanation. The questions nobody will ask out loud. When Schwortz received Barcaccia's preliminary findings, he read the report twice. Then he picked up the phone and called a colleague in the genetics community with a single question. Had anyone ever seen mitochondrial markers like this on any other historical artifact? The answer was no. In the years since the DNA findings were published, the scientific community's response has not been skepticism. Skepticism would be respectable, the normal healthy friction of scientific inquiry. What has happened instead is something more unsettling: avoidance. Researchers who would ordinarily compete to challenge anomalous data have simply declined to engage with it. No counter-studies have been published. No replication attempts have been undertaken. No formal critiques have appeared in peer-reviewed literature. Just silence, deliberate and coordinated. And in science, that kind of silence is louder than any rebuttal. In private conversations, the kind that happen in hallways after conferences, never on the record, credentialed geneticists have acknowledged that they have never encountered degradation signatures like the ones found on the Shroud on any other artifact, ever. The patterns do not simply fail to fit contamination models, they fail to fit any model currently available in the field. The questions that serious researchers are whispering but not publishing are these. What if the anomalous haplogroups are not contamination at all? What if they represent the actual genetic signature of the individuals present at the event the Shroud documents? What if the degradation patterns are pointing to an energy release, a moment of transformation? That existing science has no framework to even begin processing. These are not questions from conspiracy forums. They are questions being raised by researchers with institutional affiliations and peer-reviewed publication records, in conversations that never reach official journals because asking them publicly means placing a career on the line. And in modern academia, the Shroud of Turin is the one subject where genuine curiosity has been institutionalized as a professional liability. The evidence, in full. What 40 years produced, Schwortz has spent 4 decades presenting the accumulated scientific evidence for the Shroud in lectures, publications, and a non-profit research organization he founded in 2009, the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, dedicated to preserving this evidence for future generations of researchers. He also built Shroud.com from scratch in 1996, long before Google was a household name, because he recognized that the public was not rejecting the evidence. The public had simply never been given access to it. The site became the largest and most comprehensive scientific shroud database in existence, drawing millions of visitors annually from every country on the planet. Schwortz refused every advertising offer and every corporate sponsorship. The data would be unfiltered, or it would be nothing. When the full body of evidence is presented without institutional interference, what it shows is this: the blood chemistry confirms extreme, prolonged physical trauma consistent with crucifixion, with bilirubin levels so elevated they could only result from a degree of pre-death suffering that forensic medicine associates with prolonged torture. The image formation defies every technology in human history. A superficial discoloration so precisely controlled that the most advanced laser on the planet can only reproduce it on a surface the size of a postage stamp, and even then only approximates the result. And the DNA presents a geographic spread of mitochondrial markers from 3 continents, with degradation signatures that no known biological or chemical process can explain. Blood chemistry, image formation, genetic evidence, 3 independent scientific disciplines. Each one on its own would constitute a significant anomaly. Together, they converge on a conclusion that the official academic position has decided in advance cannot be true. The conclusion was written first. The evidence has simply refused to cooperate with it. What the cloth itself demands. We ask. There is one argument for the shroud's authenticity that Schwartz raises in lectures that does not require a single scientific instrument to evaluate. Consider the historical circumstances under which the shroud would have been removed from the tomb. Roman soldiers executed people for offenses far less serious than stealing the burial goods of a condemned criminal. Whoever took that cloth and preserved it did so at enormous personal risk, the kind of risk that rational people only accept for someone they believe was worth dying for. People do not risk crucifixion to preserve a neighbor's grave cloth. They risk it for someone they believe has just done something that overturns every assumption they have made about death. The very existence of the cloth, the fact that it was preserved at all, passed through hands willing to pay that price, is itself a statement about what those first custodians believed they were holding. Schwartz also points to something that rarely receives attention in mainstream coverage of the shroud. The image carries no theological agenda. A medieval forger trying to create a devotional object would have produced the wounds in the palms as every artist of the period painted them. The wounds on the shroud are in the wrists. A forger would have depicted the face as serene, composed, spiritually elevated, the standard iconographic presentation of Christ in European religious art. The face on the shroud is battered, swollen, and humanly agonized. A forger working for ecclesiastical approval would not have produced this. No one in a medieval scriptorium would have designed an object of religious veneration that looks like a forensic photograph of a torture victim. The image is not what a medieval Christian would have wanted to see, which raises the uncomfortable question of who made it and how. The man who could no longer pretend. People who attend Schwartz's lectures have noted that something changed in the questions audiences ask over time. In the early years, they asked about the shroud, about the data, the tests, the peer-reviewed findings. In more recent years, they started asking about him. What do you personally believe now, Barrie? For a man raised in a strict Orthodox Jewish household who had spent decades professionally refusing to allow his personal convictions to contaminate his scientific methodology, that question required a kind of honesty that 40 years of evidence had made unavoidable. Schwortz never converted. He never abandoned his Jewish identity. He has been precise and consistent on that point. But in his own words, spoken quietly and with evident weight, he was genuinely shocked to discover that God had actually been there the entire time, simply waiting for him to turn around and acknowledge it. A Jewish man, a technical photographer, a self-described skeptic who walked into this investigation to expose a fake and spent 40 years instead documenting the impossibility of it being one. That trajectory is itself one of the more remarkable details in a story already full of them. Schwortz has said that his job is not to tell people what to believe. His job is to make certain the scientific evidence survives intact, that it is available to every researcher and every ordinary person willing to examine it seriously. That mission has defined everything he has built over 4 decades, and the DNA findings, whatever they ultimately mean, are now part of that evidence, preserved, documented, and unanswered. The conclusion, the question that cannot be escaped here, is where 40 years of investigation has arrived. A cloth that cannot be explained by any known natural or artificial process. Blood chemistry consistent with catastrophic pre-death trauma that no medieval forger would have had reason or knowledge to fake. An image formation requiring an energy output that no technology in human history has ever generated. And DNA from 3 continents with degradation signatures that the researchers best equipped to explain them have quietly admitted they cannot. The official academic position is that the shroud is a medieval forgery. That position is held by people who have never published a credible explanation for how the image was formed, why the blood chemistry is consistent with extreme torture, or what accounts for the anomalous genetic signatures. The position is maintained not by evidence, but by institutional consensus, which is not the same thing as science. Schwortz's investigation did not set out to prove faith. It set out to test a claim. And after 40 years, the claim has not broken. The tests have. The question that anyone honestly engaging with this evidence is left holding is not simply whether the shroud is authentic. The question is what it would mean if it were. And that is the question that makes powerful institutions fall silent, that makes geneticists remove their names from papers, and that has kept one Jewish photographer who went to Turin expecting to spend a week and spent his life instead unable to look away. Drop what you honestly think in the comments below. If this investigation reached somewhere you did not expect, subscribe and share this video with someone who deserves access to the evidence. Because the silence around this story is not accidental, and the best way to break it is to refuse to be silent yourself.